Hi everyone, in this video we're going to talk about different character types found in most literature as well as ways that they are described through what we would call characterization. So this may not apply to everything ever that you're going to read, but it is a good baseline for how you might describe the development of different characters. So we're going to start with two different ways that authors can present characters, and by that I mean ways that they can tell the reader more about their motivation, desires, personality, and that is through either direct or indirect characterization. So we'll start with direct characterization. This is when an author directly states what a character is like, either through a statement by a narrator or another character. So it is, as the name implies, very direct. It is to the point. You do not need to infer anything or connect any dots. Either the narrator says like, so-and-so always wanted to be king, or another character does that for the narrator if there is not a narrator in the piece of literature. An example of that would be saying she tended to have a temper. Okay, straightforward, we know exactly what to expect. There is also indirect characterization. As you can probably guess, this is where you need to infer what the character is like based on what they say or do. So there may not be as direct of a statement as there is here, but you can usually get to the same conclusion. An example of indirect characterization would be maybe you have that same character and the narrator instead says she flew into a fit of rage when her coffee order was wrong. We can get to the same conclusion as we do with this first line. We just need to do a little bit more thinking. One of these is not better than the other. Typically, if a piece of literature has only direct characterization, it's usually for a younger audience. It's usually, it's just not as interesting if you're just being told what people are like all the time. If you've ever heard the phrase, show me, don't tell me, this is a great example of that, where indirect characterization is more about the showing me, direct characterization is more about the telling me. So once we have those ways of presenting characters, here are a few different ways that you might describe a character. This is aside from personality or interest or likability. This is more about their function in a piece of literature. Some of these will be familiar, some of them may not be. First, of course, is the protagonist. This is the main character of a work, the person that most things center around. There can be more than one, and there can be debate about who the protagonist really is in some cases. There's also the antagonist. This is the character who most often opposes the protagonist. There may not always be a character that's the antagonist. Sometimes it's some sort of force or societal norm that functions more as the antagonist. Can be an idea or a thing. There's not always a character who's, the mustache twirling villain. In terms of development, there are a few ways that we can describe character types. The first is a round character. This is a character who is complex. They have more than one side to them. It's usually somebody where maybe they're mostly calm, but you see them really lose their mind over something, for example. The opposite of that would be a flat character. As you can probably guess, this is a character that's a little bit more simple. They have one or two identifiable traits. That's usually about it. We also have stock characters. These are people that are more stereotypical figures. They don't really have anything unique to them within that piece of literature. They usually fall into a certain function. This is where, if you read about racist tropes in literature, this is usually where they come up the most, but it can also just be somebody that's there. Like if you're reading a YA novel and there's a teacher in there, usually the teacher is just gonna, kind of fulfill this one certain role rather than be fully developed themselves. Examples of that could be like the bad boy, the cat lady, the housewife, right? We've got these kind of stock characters where if I say, okay, there's a cat lady living upstairs in the novel, you already kind of know what to expect. You have an idea. I, as the author, do not need to invest that much time or detail into fully developing that character because just by using that stock character, you already have your own idea of what there is there. There is another way that we can describe characters, and this is as either static or dynamic. Static character is a character who's essentially the same at the end of the story as they were in the beginning. Things have maybe happened to them throughout the book, but the way they respond to them, or the way they view them, or their general outlook on things, or their relationships with other people will be essentially the same at the end as it was in the beginning. The opposite of that would be a dynamic character. This is where we see a character who has significant change throughout a story. Their personality develops a lot. Their outlook or how they see the world develops a lot. This may not always be in a positive direction. This can definitely be for the worse in some cases. Maybe the circumstances of the book got the better of them. Couple other things to keep in mind. Character types, sometimes you might see this word used as a description for people. That would be a foil. This is a character who just serves as a contrast to highlight something about the protagonist. So they are there to be the opposite of the protagonist in a way that highlights a certain trait of the protagonist. A lot of pieces of literature, movies have this as well. A great classic example of this would be Winnie the Pooh and Eeyore. So Eeyore is a foil of Winnie the Pooh, who's our protagonist, right? Winnie the Pooh has this sunny, optimistic disposition. Eeyore tends to have more of a pessimistic disposition. And the more that Eeyore shares that pessimism, the more that it highlights Winnie the Pooh's optimism by contrast. Another key term to keep in mind for characters is this idea of the tragic flaw. This does not happen all the time, but it is a good thing to keep in mind for when it does. This is where the protagonist has a flaw in a tragedy that brings them to a tragic end. So it's that thing about their personality that doesn't allow them to persevere. The most common of these is described classically as hubris, or more commonly as pride. Same thing. So a lot of times in both literature and films, pride is the most common tragic flaw, right? We see somebody encounter some big obstacle. They say, no problem, I got this, and then they don't, right? That's the most common tragic flaw in a very oversimplified way that I can describe there. So that's it for our character types in literature. Try to think about whatever you're reading and where people fit into these. Not every term will have a place for every person, but at least one of these should be able to help you write and think analytically about who you're reading about.